It's my belief, just to give you kind of a very short Cliff Notes answer, it's my belief, number one, that the Nazi atom bomb project was successful. Now, what I'm going to do is simply ask your viewers to accept that as kind of a given for the sake of argument, so that I can kind of set the context, okay? If you look at the project classification of the Bell, the Nazis classified it as Kriegsentscheidend. In other words, within the classification system of the Third Reich, the Bell was classified absolutely uniquely and at the very pinnacle of the system, and it is the only project in Nazi Germany to be given that specific classification. In other words, higher than the atom bomb. Okay? So in other words, to the Nazis, the atom bomb is, you know, already kind of old stuff. Okay? So that gives an indicator of what the significance is. But if you look at the physics that they're trying to investigate, I believe they're investigating it for three things, for the purposes of achieving three things. Number one, they want to free Germany from energy dependence on foreign powers and foreign oil. So in other words, they're investigating the so-called zero-point energy. Okay? Number two, the same sort of physics they have seen is kind of a gateway or window into advanced field propulsion, or anti-gravity, if you want to call it that. And the third thing, of course, Nazis being Nazis, is that they want to engineer this physics for a weapon. And of course, we're dealing now with a physics that, again, can engineer the fabric of space-time locally.
Okay, now, just once again to summarize this before we go into even more detail.
Sure.
What you're referring to here is you've picked up the research line that was started by
Igor Witkowski.
Nick Cook and Igor Witkowski.
Right.
This thing that seems to have been called, well, for lack of a better word, the Nazi Bell. We don't know what they called it, do we?
Well, actually, they did call it Die Glocke.
Die Glocke.
And they had another nickname for it, Der Bienenstock, the beehive, because of the sound it made. But one of the actual project code names was Project Kronos, or Project Time. It was Project Kronos, or Project Time. Okay? Now, many people leap to the conclusion that, well, they're trying to build a time machine. Well, no. Time is involved, because again, you're trying to use torsion to tap into the ability to manipulate the fabric of space-time.
What's torsion?
All right. Torsion, the way I like to illustrate it very simply, is if you take a soda can and empty the soda out of it and then wring it like a dish rag. You've got that counter-rotating motion, and it's going to spiral and fold and pleat that can and then draw the ends of the can closer together. So that kind of is my simplistic illustration of what torsion does. And the can itself would represent space-time. Okay? Now, what they're doing, I think, ultimately for the Nazis, the purpose of this is they want to weaponize it. And of course, and I've said this over and over again in my interviews, if you're dealing with a technology that has the potential to engineer space-time, that means that if you weaponize that, potentially you have a weapon that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. It's truly planet-busting stuff if you've got the proper engineering behind it and, you know, develop appropriate power systems and so on, which, again, this one and the same thing will lead to zero-point energy, so there's your power. You know, this is why I kind of prefaced my remarks by mentioning the atom bomb, because the kind of the post-war Allied legend, as I like to call it, is, of course, the Germans were a bunch of nuclear bunglers, you know, and they didn't have enough manpower and they didn't have enough money, you know, and all of this happy nonsense that you hear in the textbooks. Well, to me, this story really doesn't make much sense. And you're right. They've got Heisenberg, they've got Hartek. I mean, these people are not second stringers at all. So, yeah, what the Germans are doing, and I want to emphasize here the importance of why Nazism would be the ideological cauldron for this. Because Nazism, of course, had banned Jewish physics, in other words, relativity, okay? And they even had ideological difficulties with aspects of quantum mechanics because it was too statistical, it was too probabilistic, it wasn't deterministic enough for some of the Nazi ideologues. But what is implied by this in the standard history is that within Nazi Germany you have an absolute stamping out of the scientific method and a dead ending of physics. But I think if you look now, 100 years after relativity, we see precisely that physics has dead-ended. We have this kind of dogma in place now. What I think Nazism really did is it freed those people in a certain way to think outside the box. And all of that outside the box thinking took place inside the confines of the SS. And the signal event that kicks all this loose now in modern times, the reason we're finding out about it, is precisely German reunification.
Yes.
Why? Because when the Eastern Zone is basically annexed in a shotgun wedding by West Germany, and that's exactly how I would describe it, when that happens, all of those old SS installations in the Eastern Zone, some of which the Soviets didn't even get into, you know, the SS blew them up and the Soviets never bothered to go into them. The Germans went back in there and looked at all this stuff, and it wasn't showing up on any radar screen connected with rockets or jet aircraft or poison gas, you know, any of the other stuff that they were doing. And so they began to wonder, well, what's going on here? And then, of course, Igor finds that very strange hinge-like structure there in Ludwikowice, I think, in Poland, which used to be Ludwigsdorf, and he's wondering, well, what is this? You know, why is this here? And of course, this kicks loose the spate of declassification. This kicks loose a bunch of people coming forward from the old Eastern Zone, now able to talk about what they saw, what they observed. So this has kicked loose a fantastic amount of information.
What is the connection between this hard but brilliant and out-of-the-box physics with the occult?
I think, again, if you go back to the remarks I began with, I think if you go far enough back and look at certain types of texts, for example, the Hermetica, okay, and read them without the standard academic approach with metaphysics eyeglasses on, and read them rather as a topologist, as a mathematician would read these texts, or as and even a materials engineer, you know, might read these texts. What pops out of these things is a profound metaphor of a physical medium that creates information. In other words, way back when, if we go back to the Hermetica, here we're dealing with a text approximately, give or take, you know, 2,000 years old. So in other words, but it's an Egyptian text, even though it's written in Greek. Its provenance is clearly Egyptian. Okay, so this is very old, and yet it contains this profoundly sophisticated physics metaphor. Okay, that's what really popped out at me, you know, when I was reading these texts. It wasn't that I was supposed to be looking and seeing Platonic universals, you know, the chair of all chairs and, you know, the horse of all horses. No, none of that was what was popping out of me. What Plato's talking about is topology. He's talking about common surfaces with common forms, okay? So I'm looking at this, and then I'm looking at the Nazis, and they're coming up with these theories, essentially, in the 20s and 30s, that are looking at the physical medium as an engineerable reality. In other words, in a certain sense, as an information-creating medium, okay? So, and again, the key to creating stable information is rotation. The key to creating stable information is rotation, okay, torsion, and so on and so forth. So I'm thinking, well, this appears to be precisely what we see going on with this Bell project. They are somehow pursuing this idea of physics. And one of the things that leapt out at me that kind of made this connection very clear is in my book, The Philosopher's Stone, I refer to a fellow by the name of Himmler's Rasputin. If you can imagine Heinrich Himmler having a personal Rasputin. Well, this guy's name is Karl Maria Villegut, okay, and he has a number of aliases that he wrote esoteric treatises under. But his basic conception is that the whole universe arises out of a tension between two counter-rotating spirals which create the world egg. Okay? And when I saw that, I thought, oh boy, because of course in the bell, you know, which I rationalize as basically a kind of a hyperdimensional torsion physics device, you've got these two counter-rotating drums into which they're putting this high-density liquid, which I think may have even incorporated an isomer as one of its components. And of course, an isomer is one of these high-spin isotopes that if you de-excite it, it'll release massive amounts of energy. Well, you've got these two counter-rotating drums, and I'm thinking, well, here's the physics that they're doing, and we've got these two counter-rotating things. And over here, Himmler's Rasputin is saying, well, this is all coming out of two counter-rotating systems, you know. So I think clearly you had an ideological culture in the SS that, rather than inhibiting scientific progress, really kind of forced them to pursue all of this higher dimensional physics.
It actually gave them an inspirational boost.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And you know, the kind of the final nail in the coffin, as far as I'm concerned, is if you look at the swastika itself, you know, and view that as not so much the corporate logo of the Nazi Party, but as an ideogram of this whole physics idea. Well,
it looks like a vector diagram.
Yeah, it looks like a vector diagram, exactly. Yeah. You know, you've got a subsystem of rotation, you've got a subsystem of stress, and you throw them together and twist that thing, and there's your parallel transports in the tensor calculus, and voila, you know, you're on your way. Now,
but in a sense, that symbol came out of India. So
oh, sure,
you
yeah.
say that they actually went back to the original meaning of the symbol and picked up on it because it was supposed to
bingo,
spin.
bingo, exactly. And you know, if you kind of can imagine Walter Gerlach being challenged, you know, let's assume the project's underway when the Nazis take power. Gerlach got his wish, he got funding from the Weimar government, and he's doing his spin experiments, okay? And he was fascinated with spin and magnetic resonance and gravitation. You know, he corresponded with Austrian physicist Thirring. You know, the Lenza-Thirring effect, satellite drag, and all this, you know, this was his bag. So imagine the Nazis come in and say, well, Professor Dr. Gerlach, we're going to shut your project down. You know, it looks too suspicious to us. It's dealing in areas we don't want to deal with. You know, it's just not part of our ideology. Well, all Gerlach has to do is say, Herr Himmler, it's right there on your armband. Okay? He's, you know, he's already sold them, you know, in a certain sense. And you're right. Because the other thing about the bell that I should mention in this context with India is that this serum 525 that they're putting inside this device and spinning up, well, number one, it's a liquid. Number two, it's of heavy density. Number three, it's of kind of a maroonish violet color, okay, and very heavy. So I'm thinking of a liquid metal, okay, mercury. So probably mercury is one thing. And there's your connection to India. Because, of course, as you know, in the Vimana texts, you have references to mercury vortexes. And, just to kind of make a final nail in the coffin, mercury is kind of an ideal candidate if you're going to use plasmas in this thing. And again, you know, you have astrophysicists in Germany, Hüdermans, looking at the sun, thinking, okay, we've got nuclear fusion up there, and they've already noticed the sun rotates, but the plasma is rotating at different velocities, so you've got this differential rotation, they call it, but that's just a fancy word for, you know, it's rotating at different velocities, and they're putting all this together in this device. It's bell-shaped. It stands about 12 to 15 feet high, 9 to 12 feet wide. It's either cased in a kind of a ceramic metal or just plain old ceramic. It's got heavy-duty electrical cabling ports around the device. Inside the device, there are two counter-rotating drums, and I want to be clear here. The data that we have does not specify the internal configuration of those drums within the bell. These two counter-rotating drums had a serum, this serum 525 I mentioned earlier, the heavy maroonish red, probably mercury compound. It is cryogenically cooled either by liquid oxygen or liquid nitrogen, and it is close to an electrical power plant and sounds like a beehive. Okay, the electrical power plant is, to kind of put a hyperbole on it, mere yards away, okay, from the installations that the bell is being tested in. All right.
Is that the kind of hum you get from a high voltage generator?
Yes. Okay. Now, let's put all these things. Those are the data points, and the final.
And this is known how, Joe?
This is known by an SS general by the name of Jakob Sporenberg, who was part of this project because he was the general that was tasked at the end of the war to go in and murder 60 of the scientists involved with the project. In other words, the Nazis want to keep this thing absolutely quiet.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, that's how all this comes out. He's tried for that crime by a Polish war crimes tribunal because, of course, Poland slid westward and took over parts of Pomerania and Silesia that were formerly German provinces. And the bell was tested in that part of Germany that then became Poland after the war. So Poland assumed jurisdiction over this man for that crime, and we know it by the affidavit that he gave at that war crimes trial. Okay? But it's important again to realize it's after the collapse of the Iron Curtain, it's after the collapse of the East German state and basically the shotgun wedding, that was had in 1989, that all of this comes out. Okay? Now, Sporenberg also describes the effect of the device on plants. Plants exposed to the field of this thing when it was operating would decay to a kind of a brownish gray goo within a matter of either hours or weeks. This would vary.
Right, and they come apart.
Yeah, they just literally fall apart, this blue. And they would do so without putrefaction. The first time it was tested, apparently the Germans had not done something correctly, and 7 of the original scientists of the project were killed when it was tested the first time. Later on, apparently, they learned how to kind of control some of these deadly effects a little bit more reasonably. But those are the data points. And one little final bit of information, a final bit of data point. When it was tested underground, it had to be tested in a room lined with ceramic bricks over which were placed rubber mats. After each test, concentration camp victims would come in, remove the rubber mats, burn the mats, and then scrub down the ceramic bricks with brine. Okay, that had to be done for some reason after each test.
Radioactivity?
Yes, I think so. I think so. Again, and I'm mentioning that because it's a crucial data point. Then, when it was tested outside, it was tested apparently inside this hinge-like structure that is near all of these strange installations with this electrical power plant right there, This hinge stood in a kind of a basin, a pool. It looks like that would have contained some sort of liquid. Around the perimeter of this pool, there are, and you can see this on the History Channel documentary with Nick Cook. Igor takes Nick down into this structure, and you can see these entry ports for all of this heavy-duty electrical cabling. Okay, and apparently, when tested at night, these concentration camp inmates described this barrel-like thing that would glow, a pale blue glow, and it would rise above the tree line and kind of sit there, and then it would fall back down. Okay, lower back down. So those are our data points. Okay, I don't think that the dimensions of the device at this point in my research are functionally significant. So let's turn to the cryogenic cooling. Okay, we're dealing already, we know, with a device that is using these 2 counter-rotating cylinders, and I suspect that their centrifuge isotope technology had something to do with this because they're using ultra-high mechanical rotation. In other words, this is a precision machine, okay? And it's being cryogenically cooled. And the first thing that I think of is superconductivity. Again, a high-spin system, little resistance. It's a kind of a self-contained little bubble of its own.
Was superconductivity understood in the physics of that time?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay.
And then the next thing is we have this mysterious substance which they're putting into these cylinders and spinning up at high speed. I think that the presence of this power plant and the sound of the bell as a beehive indicates that this whole thing was electrically pulsed with extremely high voltage direct current electricity, okay? And that the drums were set up, and Igor agrees with me here, this is his analysis that I'm borrowing from, that you have a cathode and an anode, and this will arc to the center, and as this stuff is spinning and cohering along the same plane of rotation and being pulsed, electrically pulsed, it's going to drive it inward, create little plasmoids, and you're going to get even more spin out of this thing. That you have a cathode and an anode, and this will arc to the center, and as this stuff is spinning and cohering along the same plane of rotation and being pulsed, electrically pulsed, it's going to drive it inward, create little plasmoids, and you're going to get even more spin out of this thing. So in other words, the way I'm rationalizing the device ultimately is they are attempting to maximize by every possible means this extreme torsion shear effect. This is exactly what they're going after. They're trying to figure out if they can manipulate and engineer the fabric of space-time.
With what? With what end?
To what end? Again, I think there's these three purposes in mind. The bell is part of the departmental oversight, let's say, of the bell, is three things. First, you have some attachment to the Forschung, Entwicklung und Patente, which is a super secret SS entity that is pulling every patent application within the Third Reich and later occupied Europe that has national security implications. Number two, it's under an entity called SS Entwicklungsstelle 4, which means Development Area 4. Okay? The mission brief of that department is to make Germany energy independent. And it's that department that you have investigating things like controlled fusion, zero-point energy, and so on and so forth. So it's attached to that department. And then the final department that it's attached to is General Hans Kammler and his think tank down in the Pilsen, Czechoslovakia in the Skoda Munitions Works. And the mission brief of that department of the SS is to brainstorm its way from first generation to second and third and fourth generations, and here's the key, to work out the necessary steps in the technology tree to get from one to the other, and then to do it. Okay? So the bell is connected with all these departments, and what this suggests to me, given the physics involved here, is that they're trying to create a prototype technology, and I want to emphasize this. This thing is not a UFO, it is not itself a weapon, and it is not itself a zero-point energy device. It's a prototype technology or a gateway technology that they're using and developing to investigate each of those three areas. Okay, that I think is what you have with this project. But I think the results were significant enough to them by 1944 that they give it this extreme classification of Kriegsentscheidend, war decisive. So they're already seeing the military potential of this thing. This is a field propulsion potential here of just extraordinary capability, and this is a weapon potential here of just extraordinary capability. But it's a kind of a unified technology. It seems like the further east we go, the less panic and hysteria there is. But it's this bailout without oversight idea that looks to me, that's the kind of behavior of someone who's being blackmailed with a gun to their head. Well, we want a lot of money, but we can't tell you what it's for.
This is a very, very interesting thesis.
Yeah, it's very suspicious. Now, to put it into context with Nazis, and I think the reason, perhaps for your question, is that the only thing I see within the context of recent history in the last 60 to 70 years that could put that extremely powerful Anglo-American corporate banking interest or elite in that kind of peril is precisely an entity that had enormous amounts of liquid capital that it moved into their banks and left there for a very long time as part of a deal. We'll give you this money, do with it what you will, leave us alone.
Is this a research angle that you would like to follow in the coming months as more information becomes available about the current crisis?
I'm not really a conspiracy theorist. I touch on these things only when it seems like the physics aspects lead there, but I get asked this question a lot, so I've kind of speculated, reasoned out this kind of scenario. But I can tell you this. I'm researching a book, writing a book now, that deals with, I hope effectively, deeply seated and rooted reasons for this very strange connection between physics and finance that seems to pop up over and over and over again. And I'll only say this, it's very deeply rooted and very, very old.
Yes. That's a beautiful thought to leave a lot of people to ponder. Something
leave them hanging.
Something that Peter Levender mentioned beautifully, succinctly when we talked to him last week. He said, look, the whole world can't go broke. Someone's got to have the money.
Exactly.
And something that seems very obvious to us when we're knocking this subject around between us is that if you look at all the black projects, all the modern day equivalents of the Bell experiments, wherever they are, on this planet or even elsewhere, then this is costing money. And if you think of money as energy, it's like this energy is being drained out of the global circuit and it's going somewhere.
Where is it going?
Yeah, where is it going?
Exactly.
Which is another way of reframing the same question that I believe you're asking. Yeah.
Exactly.
Now,
If they permeated NASA, they have to permeate, the undercover, black projects
Right.
thoroughly, and that means they've permeated the real secret government of the United States.
But
so there's an alignment there.
Okay, ask yourself this. The Hadron Collider, okay? You've got two huge counter-rotating rings, and they're going to spin up these particles and smash them together, okay? I find that whole counter-rotating idea really weird, suggestively weird. But the really weird thing to me is, why is the first Christian Democratic Union Party Chancellorin of Germany, after Kohl, okay, a physicist? Did you know that?
I did not.
She's a PhD in physics.
Okay.
Why is she a PhD in physics?
A PhD in physics.
Yeah, and now you know what a German PhD is like to
I do.
get. You know, they don't hand them out by any means. And, you know, this to me, why is someone like that even in politics? But especially at that level. You know, this is not a PhD in physics becoming premier of Somalia. You know, this is a rather sophisticated nation technologically. So that to me, you know, it's another little indicator that we have to watch things over there very carefully.